First, I'd like to recognize some proud family in the room. Jason's mother, Judy Langford, right there in the middle, along with Jason's stepdad, Bob Thompson, and Paige's proud brother, Kent Alexander, is here. There he is. Before I introduce our guest speakers today, I'd like to acknowledge an interesting connection between the Carter Center and Atlanta Rotary. The original idea of the Carter Center was hatched some 40 years ago by President and Mrs. Carter in partnership with Emory University, which at that time was led by distinguished Rotarian Jim Laney. Since then, over half of all the chairs of the Carter Center Board of Counselors have been members of this club. Our own Clark Dean is the current chair. Last year, Laura Turner Seidel sat in the seat, and before Laura was Chair Mary Moore, and before Mary, Chair Shyam Reddy. Other members of Atlanta Rotary who have chaired the Carter Center Board of Counselors include Shan Cooper, Martha Brooks, Dennis Lockhart, Ken Byers, Claire Arnold, Ingrid Saunders-Jones, Paula Bevington, Jim Lentz, and Jim Balloon. I could go on, but I think you get the point. This is simply the best Rotary club in the world. No other explanation. But from where I sit, it's a source of pride that goes both ways. Serving as another example of Atlanta Rotary's longstanding commitment to civic leadership and community service, and the remarkably strong hometown support the Carter Center enjoys as an international NGO based in Atlanta. Okay, enough of that. Moving right along to the business at hand. 4 years ago, when the Carter Center Board of Trustees went looking across the globe for a new leader, the search committee found her in Brussels, Belgium, where she was running the European Cooperative for Rural Development, a nonprofit focused on improving the lives of farmers in Africa. She also happened to have her own deep Atlanta roots. Paige Alexander left Atlanta for college in 1984 and didn't look back until early 2020, when board chair Jason Carter asked her to come back home and lead the Carter Center. Paige had accumulated over 25 years of global development experience in government and nonprofit sectors, including two Senate-confirmed appointments at regional bureaus, notably the Middle East and North Africa of the United States Agency for International Development, covering USAID missions and development programs in 25 countries with responsibility for more than 1,000 employees and a budget over $1.4 billion. Paige's leadership style has been described as dynamic, collaborative, and strategic, with one senior State Department official observing that Paige Alexander always seems to get her way and to make you feel like it's your idea. Paige and Steve Grant have two daughters, Rachel and Carly, and one son, Josh, who is attending Emory College and scoring lots of goals on the soccer team. Jason joined the Carter Center Board of Trustees 15 years ago and has served as board chair for the last 10. He is a partner at Bondurant, Mixon, and Elmore, combining a successful litigation practice with a strong commitment to public service. From 2010 to 2015, he served in the Georgia State Senate, and he was the 2014 Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia. He has been recognized as a super lawyer by Atlanta Magazine for 8 years running, and has received many other awards for his legal work and community service, including the Anti-Defamation League's Stuart Eisenstadt Award. Jason served as a Peace Corps volunteer in South Africa from 1998 to 2000. He and Kate have two sons, Henry and Thomas, all are at Midtown High. Kate teaches English, and the two boys are in the high school. Since Jason and Paige have teamed up, the Carter Center has successfully moved from a founder-led organization to one with more developed governance and structured decision-making. The program budgets for peace and health have grown over 50% to $150 million a year. The democracy program has pivoted to the U.S. domestic elections, and the health programs have a much clearer picture of life after the guinea worm. The Carter Center is indeed lucky to have this 1-2 punch at the top to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex and polarized world, while at the same time honoring the legacy of the founders. I believe if you're lucky enough to be associated with fine leaders like Paige and Jason, sometimes it's just best to get out of their way. With that, I'll leave it to David Lewis, who needs no introduction and will moderate today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendell. First, a more important thing, as I was walking up the stage, John Yates confirmed he's going to be singing at each future meeting. Just get that out of the way. I want to start, Jason, with you. First of all, I think from all of the club, condolences on the loss of your grandmother. And also, you said on the phone that your grandfather's probably going to outlive all of us, but I'm sure everybody wants to know how he's doing.
Sure, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the folks that have come up to me earlier today just to help with this incredible outpouring of love that we have all felt over the last couple months in my family. My grandparents, their 77-year marriage inspired so many people, but really this community in Atlanta, and then of course in their home in Plains, has been such a fundamental part of who they are. It's been wonderful to feel that support from everyone. So I just want to say on behalf of my family, number one, thank you to all of you and to the rest of the folks out there in the world who've been a part of that outpouring for us. It has made these last few months actually a joyous time for my family. My grandfather, I go to Ebenezer Baptist Church, and so my pastor is also my senator, which is kind of weird, but I was talking to him the other day and said, I don't understand what's going on, because they told us in March of last year that they thought my grandfather would have about a week. And so we all planned and started to figure things out. And then lo and behold, once my grandmother had her relatively steep decline at the very end, we thought that my grandfather would be soon after. And as my pastor told me, there's just things about the spirit you're not going to understand. And for me, that was just liberating, because I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that he is at home. He's with my uncles and aunt and grandchildren at different times, and is doing okay. I mean, the folks that saw him at the funeral know he's severely limited physically. It's very hard for him to do anything, but he continues to have experiences and he continues to find value. And I think for me, the thing that gives me the most solace is that at this moment in his life, that faith journey that he has been on, there are parts of it that you can only do at the very end, and I think he is cherishing that right now. And otherwise, he's just, to your point, no telling what is next for him. So,
I'm curious for you as board chair and as the grandson, what it's like to have that legacy fall on your shoulders.
The good thing is it doesn't fall on my shoulders at all, because there's so many other people who share it, right? That's one of the things that we have talked about extensively at the Carter Center. My grandmother's legacy in mental health is now carried out in many ways by Eve Bird, by so many of the other people who are even here today to continue that work. And part of their great legacy is that they built this organization that has got an incredible endowment, an incredible track record, all of the things that it needs to continue forward, right? And as Paige and I will, I guess, talk about later, the most remarkable aspect of their legacy is building this organization that will survive and thrive without them. And that's not an easy task. It's a complicated task. But yes, I have the name, and yes, I'm the board chair. But I don't feel like I have to carry that on my own. And if I did, I think it would be crushing, because there's just no way to think about trying to do that. And so it's been a wonderful, maybe you'll have to tell me, Ms. Governor, if this is just like a crutch or a projection or something, but I have had really a good time of unloading that on the backs of people like the ones in this room and like our partners across the country history in the world. So I feel great about it because of how strong their legacy left the center.
Paige, the description of today's program is innovating on a legacy of activism, and obviously a lot of people want to know, what does the future of the Carter Center hold, because there is a new generation coming over, and the founders are moving on. The traditional issues have been waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope in vulnerable communities. What does the future hold for the Carter Center?
Well, much like Jason said, his grandparents set a North Star for us, and it was global health and peace, and working with the most vulnerable and not duplicating efforts of others. And so when President Carter decided that he was going to eradicate guinea worm, only the second human disease ever to be eradicated besides smallpox, and the first one done with just behavior change, people were not entirely sure that this was something a group from Atlanta, Georgia was going to be able to accomplish. And so part of what they left us with is, it's not just the 250 people in Atlanta, it's the 3,300 people overseas in our offices who were doing this work. And so recognizing that the bulk of our activities really are overseas, even when I came in and COVID hit, we didn't have to bring people home, because all politics is local, all development is local. If you can't do it in your community, it might not be able to get done. So we have followed that global health trajectory. We're going to eradicate a disease, we're going to eliminate trachoma and river blindness and lymphatic filariasis and all sorts of things you don't want me to talk about during lunch. And we're going to control other diseases, while at the same time recognizing that peace is an important part of building strong communities. So when we're thinking about Sudan, 1993, President Carter negotiated a guinea worm ceasefire. There was an area in Sudan that was endemic with guinea worm. And I will just say, if you look at the American Medical Association, the serpent that's on that's guinea worm. It is the longest parasitic or disease that has been out there. And we wanted to get to it in Sudan. And so he worked to negotiate a peace, to have warring parties stop fighting so we could get health packages in. That is sort of the trajectory that we continue to go by now. There are ways to do peace, there are ways to do health, and sometimes we work together and sometimes they don't, but we'll continue to do those type of activities.
And David, if I could just add to that, I think people sometimes forget, yes, the Carter Center is in Atlanta, but as Paige said, there's 3,000 employees that are not in Atlanta. We have twice as many employees in Ethiopia as we do in Georgia, and far more in Chad, just because that's one of the last places for guinea worm eradication. And so it is truly an international organization in those ways, and the people on the ground in those communities are the ones that not only work with the Carter Center, but are the Carter Center. And it's something that we had to focus on. Sorry.
Well, give us a sense. I mean, everyone here is very familiar with the Carter Center, but just give us a sense of the scale. I don't think people know. Wendell mentioned a $150 million budget. You said 3,300 people overseas, but what is the total number of employees, the total budget, the number of countries you're working in? Paige.
Yeah, so we're about 3,600 people total between our field offices, Atlanta, and now some of the work we do domestically, which we're happy to talk about. And our budget, we have more than doubled it. We are looking at areas in terms of innovating the negotiations that were done in Sudan to try to negotiate so we could get in for guinea worm. We're using those same skill sets now in Central Florida, in Georgia, and Arizona. So we're taking some of these lessons that we've learned on conflict resolution and peace, and we're also doing it domestically. So we also have people around the United States that are working with us now. They're not full-time employees. We have a lot of contractors and grantees and working with organizations. So we consider ourselves sort of a convener of sorts, but an implementer of other pieces. And Eve's program, mental health program here, and policing alternative diversion program, we're doing a lot in Georgia that we hadn't done before as well. So at any given time, we are well over 3,000 people, but it's the focus now that we're down to 11 cases of guinea worm in the world last year. That was last year. As those numbers go down, we're trying to find a way to repurpose a lot of the community volunteers that we have to make sure that they can do things like Greg Vaughn and I saw with in South Sudan with trachoma surgeries. And so we like to keep people in the fold of the Carter Center and continue just building the programs because they know us, we know them, and they know their communities.
I think another part of the scale that's important is that the Carter Center has been in some of these communities in central Mali or in Liberia or even in the West Bank for 30 years. And in places where many, many other people have left or never were or came for a minute and then left, South Sudan, Liberia, Mali, these are folks that have grown up alongside Carter Center partners, known in every village, and that credibility is a part of that scale. It's really over the time that we've demonstrated that we're willing to not just tackle difficult problems and difficult situations, but stay and be persistent until we finish the job.
You're going to be very sad you gave us microphones. I'm sorry, but I also, just to feed on what Jason said, I'll give you an example. Ebola in Liberia. Because we had been there for so many years, when CDC went in and started telling people in Liberia, you can't bury your dead this way, you're spreading the disease, they wouldn't listen. But they listened to the Carter Center because we had been there for decades, and our conflict resolution program talked to religious leaders and said, here's the problem. You need to find a different way to bury people with Ebola because you are spreading it. And so we were able to work collectively to find a new way to do that so the communities weren't being devastated. So it's examples, like Jason said, of talking people into collecting water differently in Ethiopia than they've always been collecting it. We carry a credibility that your grandparents built and that our expertise and our staff and country have built. So. Sorry.
You mentioned on the phone that you're not in Ukraine because you make a point of going to places where other people do not go. And I think that's something that people aren't familiar with. I also think the most of the audience are probably pretty unfamiliar with your domestic work because all of your work, whether it's conflict mediation, election monitoring, the disease work, has been overseas. So you mentioned a couple of things, but what specifically are you doing here in the U.S. and why?
Yeah, let me answer the fill vacuums part. Like, one of the things that my grandfather and grandmother both really wanted to do is when they got out of the White House, they realized they had this platform. And they could basically make people care about stuff, right? Because, well, if Jimmy Carter's doing it, then it's interesting, right? And so what they did, literally, and I think in part because of their faith background and because of them being from a tiny 600-person village kind of in the middle of nowhere, is that they said, we want to do things that no one else will do. We do not want to duplicate the effective efforts of others. And one of the things that has meant is that we end up places that no one else is willing to go by definition. And we tackle issues that no one else is willing to tackle by definition. But that has been taxed a bit by the domestic work, and we have been doing democracy and election observation for 40 years. We've observed over 110 or 120 elections in different countries around the world, but we'd never done anything in the United States, in part because of that idea that we didn't want to duplicate the effective efforts of others. But over the last several years, beginning, I say, in 2018, 2020, we started looking at what was going on in the United States and realizing that we had a unique voice and a unique role to play based upon this vast history of democracy building and conflict resolution. So that's the background, and now I'll just turn it to Paige to talk about what we do.
Yeah, I'm going to tell this story about when we went down to Plains, your grandparents. So I arrived in June 2020, middle of COVID here in Atlanta. Get off the plane, people are asking if I've been to Iran or China, as if that's going to change the situation in Georgia, which the numbers were going up. And Kent picks me up, we drive down Peachtree. It's the weekend after the murder of George Floyd, so I see the aftermath of what Peachtree, the protests. I get to my parents' house, President of the United States on TV, tear gassing Lafayette Square. So that was my reentry, having lived for 3 years in Amsterdam and Brussels and Neverland. And I thought, I'm running an international NGO, and this is happening in my country. And so I called Jason, who I had not known until this process started, and I was like, we got to talk to your grandparents. We're going to have to do something domestically. So we went down to Plains, and I remember saying, we do have an endowment, and I said, what are you saving your money for? And he said, a rainy day. It's like, it's pouring outside. And of course, for those who know Jimmy Carter and his frugality, he sort of looked at me and said, "You're going to spend all my money." And I thought he was being cheeky, so I said, "I just got here. You've seen nothing yet." And Jason's like, "Do not joke with my grandfather about that." And I said, we really can't work in Cote d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe and Venezuela if we're not willing to look in Bartow County and Fulton County in our backyard. So Jason, together with the board, agreed to lean in, and we didn't really have enough time in 2020 to raise money from Soros and the Koch brothers, so we used our own endowment earnings to start this process. We are now 4 years into it. We are working in 19 different states. We are doing the same conflict resolution we do overseas in Arizona, Florida, North Carolina. We're doing the same election observation in Michigan, Fulton County. We are trying to take those lessons learned, but at the end of the day, we are still an international development organization. So I'm being very careful about going on tilt and doing too much domestically, but it's time, and it needs to be done now. And fortunately, with Jason's support and the board's support, we've really leaned in on that. And at Georgia, I was talking to Katie, Georgia supports the vote. I know that was going on here when I first got here in 2020 to get Georgia leaders, business leaders engaged. I know that the chamber is doing their poll watching. There's a lot that needs to be done that we will continue to lean in on. But we're still an international development organization, so it's that balance.
I noticed in reading through some of your documents, you're working on a number of programs, including one regarding racial reconciliation in churches, which I found very interesting, and also as a journalist, and if you think of the first mandate of the four-way test that the governor pointed out and President John, is it the truth? You're also doing work on misinformation and disinformation. Can you talk about those two issues, racial reconciliation and in churches and the digital issues?
I'll let Paige talk about racial reconciliation in specifics to what our programs are, but just one of, I think, the great sorrows of my grandparents' lives has been the way that the public face of our religion has been transformed in many ways, in many different contexts. And I think, one of the things that's true about other religions as well. I mean, particularly as we have gone out into the world looking at democracy, looking at conflict, we see, and particularly my grandfather wrote an entire book about the impact of religion on women's rights and how fundamentally important it is to get back to some of the true teachings of these religions and not allow so much of the sort of patriarchal aspects of the newer human-based religions to take over in a variety of these ways and become vehicles not for liberation but for human rights abuses. And so we have confronted that around the world in many different contexts. At home, I think in many ways the public face and the political face of our religion has been disturbing for them over the years. And this is not, it's up and down obviously a little bit, but that's something that we've confronted. I'll let Paige talk specifically about what we're doing in Atlanta on that, but just to touch on mis and disinformation for 1 second. Tom Crick and others who are here, who are our Liberia experts, when I was in Liberia for their 2 elections ago, this is a country that has very limited electricity, very limited infrastructure of any kind. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, I think by far. And yet, when we were confronting what was happening in their elections, it was so much driven by social media discussion, social media impact. Here's the disinformation, here's what's going on. And we realized that this is not just an American issue or an issue in Europe or the South America. Everywhere in the world is confronting what happens when information starts to flow without the kind of credibility that comes from the first goal of Rotary, right? We don't have that vehicle to help us. Obviously, in the United States, there has been this upswell of discussion about mis and disinformation, but we come to it again in a unique way with this very broad international understanding and watching this happen over and over and over again in many different cultures, in many different communities. And so that background brings us to where we are. And of course, there's many people who are fighting mis and disinformation, but we have done it in a slightly different way. So let me turn it to Paige to talk specifically about what's going on. But that's the background for me on those 2 issues.
Let me just follow up
Please.
1 second before we talk about racial reconciliation. You mentioned on the phone that you're working with Meta, Facebook, and if anyone is responsible for the world being the way it is right now and the spread of disinformation through social media, it is Facebook. So can you just talk a little bit about what you're doing with Meta?
I'll let Paige handle that. but I will say in many parts of the world, when people talk about the internet, they're really just talking about Facebook, right? I mean, that is the way that people interact with each other on their phones and elsewhere. So I mean, the amount of power that resides in that private company is truly staggering.
Yeah, I would say part of it's our age, but Facebook is a way we all communicate, but TikTok and so many different other new platforms are out there now. And it's like whack-a-mole. There's no way that, when you've got Twitter and everybody else letting go of their integrity unit, their staff at the integrity units, we're not going to be able to do the whack-a-mole with that. Our relationship with AI for Good, Meta, Google, others, is we're considered, much like in Liberia, a responsible party. So if we raise our hand and say, this is actually causing conflict, these are repeat offenders who are putting out mis and disinformation, we get listened to a little bit more than the mother who calls and says, I want you to take my daughter's Facebook page down. So, we are in the realm of how we deal with some of these corporations, but there's so much out there. I just did a commentary in the Chicago Tribune on Friday, which talks about all the things we need to be worried about in terms of this upcoming election, democracy, and information. We at the Carter Center have always been about education. It's been transparency, education, making people know what they're walking into, that when your ballot goes into a box, it's not going into a shredder. It's, that's the hand ballot in Georgia that they get to recount later, and the reason you don't take it home is because you don't want a receipt in case somebody says, who'd you vote for? There are all sorts of things that people are wondering, why aren't we doing it this way? And so we're just trying to do the education piece on that. On the racial injustice, we work with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and Jill, and we work with evangelicals, the Jewish community, the multi-faith community. We're trying to, again, not make it interfaith, but it's multi-faith. There's a group called the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network that is doing a lot of work together, and we're coming to terms with a lot of our history that we, as Americans, have never looked at before. So we've got some fellowship trips and things that are traveling to remind people what the history is and to face it, to accept it, and to figure out how to move on.
Jason, earlier you mentioned that the Carter Center had been on the West Bank for 30 years. That the Middle East has been a place that you spend a lot of time, and it's a place that has gotten the Carter Center in a lot of trouble as well. And I wanted your take on, both of your takes on what's happening with Israel, with Gaza.
Sure. So, my family's kind of weird in a variety of ways, as you can imagine. But one of them is that when I was 20 years old, my grandfather said, I think you should come with me on this trip. And sometimes that's like a skiing trip or whatever. For me, it was to Gaza City. And we went for the election in 1995 in January. And so I've been back and forth for 30 years, which is, an amazing gift that they gave to me. But that's, our dinner table talk. I mentioned the pain that my grandparents feel from what they feel like has happened to the public face of their religion. I think the other greatest pain that my grandfather feels is that there is not peace in the Middle East, which he considers to be a step that was part and parcel of the Camp David Accords, where there was this close moment where Egypt and Israel reached this agreement that has never been violated, and he feels like it was an obligation of his to continue to push that forward and to push for peace. And I think it drove him for the rest of his life, and still today. And I think really what our job has to be at the Carter Center is to maintain that focus on peace. what is the end game here? How do we get from here to some stable, just peace? And I think, yes, the Carter Center has been there for the last 30 years, or since I was there in 1995, and never left, despite over the last, I would say, 7 years, 8 years, really having a hard time seeing, walking down the road we were walking down, how that road eventually led to peace. So our job, and I think hopefully all of us can participate in this, no matter where you come from about the history or the present or how we got to this minute, we can all say what we have to do is find out how we get to a minute down the road, wherever it is, that looks like a just and sustainable peace. And so that's where we're going to focus. That's how we're going to do it. Now, Paige, just to tell you, when she came to this organization, she was coming in for the interview, and I literally turned to Wendell and Kathy Bremer, who's here, and said, hey, does she have any Atlanta connections? And they said, it's Miles and Elaine's daughter. It's Kent's brother. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea. And so
Actually, he describes her as the prodigal sister.
Yes, right, exactly. She'd been gone. But my point is as somebody who grew up in the Atlanta Jewish community in a really fundamental way, it's been really important for us at the Carter Center to have her here in these moments. And it's been really difficult personally for all of us at the Carter Center to feel like we were carrying out the traditions and the beliefs of my grandfather in that quest, that unending quest for peace, and also managing this moment that has become so difficult to even have a conversation about. So I just wanted to say that and then let you talk.
Jason likes to say, this is a time we're really missing my grandfather's voice. I'm like, yeah, I'm not missing it so much. I mean, as much as we had a lengthy conversation when he interviewed me, because he said, I understand you're Jewish, and what do you know about the West Bank and Gaza? And, I've spent a lot of time, I covered for the U.S. government, I covered our programs in West Bank and Gaza, and went with the Carter Center 18 months ago. I was in Gaza City. But I think the real issue right now is it's not binary. You don't stand with Israel or you free Palestine. It's just not that binary. And I think the inhumanity that happened on October 7th, we can't forget our fundamental need to do what the Carter Center does, which is to figure out what the path forward is. This is a Palestinian issue that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed as we do everything locally with the world's community behind it. And so we are treading very carefully, but it's difficult right now because I think people are just see it as a binary issue. I look at Eric.
All right. One last question before I turn it over to the audience, which is one of the themes this year of President John is leadership lessons. And wonder if you have any specific leadership lessons in your work that you could share with us today.
I think for me, a lot of folks here have been involved in organizations in transition. And I think that the interesting thing about where the Carter Center is today is the Carter Center started doing strategic plans for when my grandparents would, quote, become less active like 30 years ago. And so, 35 years would pass, and then there'd be 25 years ago, they would do another one about when they become less active. And finally, I guess it was maybe 8 years ago, I said, look, we're going to do this strategic plan about when you guys, quote, become less active. Like, tell me what you think about that. My grandfather said, I don't want to keep working on this into my dotage. That's what he said, quote. And then I sent him an email back, and I said, Papa, do you want to stop doing the day-to-day operations of the Carter Center? He said, yes. And I said, so you want this planning process to be about removing you from the decision-making process? And he wrote back, yes. And I printed the email out, and I took it to him. I took it to him probably 15 times. And I said, do you really want this or not? Because this is what you said in the email. And all of you've probably been on both sides of that divide, right? Where he really knows in his heart and in his head that he wants to step back, but it's so hard for him to do it because it's his life's work. And so what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, and some of it was health issues that the both of them had, but he did at one point just say, I'm not coming to any more executive committee meetings. And after Paige started and after a few phone calls, we had a monthly phone call, he said, we don't need to do these anymore. And he just felt he was able to let go. But what that meant for us is that we had to replace not just his external and her external facing aspects of the center, but really the internal decision making at the center has been almost more difficult because frankly, we're excellent at raising money. We are excellent at carrying out the programs. Jimmy Carter, we don't need Jimmy Carter to do that stuff. But when we have decisions within the organization, how we are able to replace the credibility that comes from him is just fundamentally difficult. And so we've had to build that process in real ways. But I think we've been successful in doing it. That was what was surprising to me, was how hard the internal piece was as compared to the external.
One very short question for Jason.
I was just say, Paige actually did her homework on this, I will say, and she has a couple quick leadership lessons that I'm going to put up on the screen because I know people take pictures of these. And one of the keys there, and I think we'll all appreciate that, was the importance of listening. So Paige, just share that with us.
All right, and my short question, oh, sorry, Paige, go ahead.
No, I was just, you have it up on the, there you go.
They're up there.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to listen. Growing up in a family with Miles and Elaine, Kent, David, and Michael, I was never the smartest person in the room, so I learned how to listen and then say what I thought was right. I think you have to be decisive and follow through, but only after you've listened, and surround yourself with the right people, because you have to find people who are not like you and that allow you to learn and grow. And that's why I love this job so much, because I don't usually read the Lancet Medical Journal, but now I do. These are not things I would have done normally. So it's because I have such a great team and I'm learning.
All right, Jason, just, since you now are the head of this organization and have this incredible responsibility, does that mean you're giving up electoral politics?
I have given up electoral politics in the past.
Okay.
I don't know, it looks kind of gross out there, electoral politics, doesn't it? I mean, who wants to be in that? I don't know.
Why don't we open up the questions? We've got a mic here, please. Feel free to queue up. And, we've got some folks getting ready to queue up. Think about your questions. I'd also say that if you look at these leadership lessons, what's interesting too is, Paige, your focus on listening, but also this third bullet, surround yourself with the right people. They won't be just like you, but a leader should know the strengths and weaknesses and ensure they have built a team that fills the niches. I think oftentimes people look for, like-minded people, but the idea of being able to bring people together is really what the Carter Center's done, with different strengths and weaknesses. RK.
Thank you, John. You heard a lot about, how are you today? Good to see you here. Is it your first time? You've been here before. Come again. So I just want to say that you heard a lot about Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and I was introduced to both of them, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, by Jimmy Carter's mother over 60 years ago. So that's number one. Number two, you heard a lot about Jimmy Carter. I'm going to tell you a quick story and then ask a question. The quick story is that a long time ago, I got a phone call. Jason, you know the story. I got a phone call at Memphis airport and said, President Jimmy Carter is calling. I came on the phone and he said, RK, so-and-so person wants to give over $1 million, almost $5 million to Carter Center. You know him? I said, I don't think so, but I'll find out. He said he wants to make sure he's a legit guy, otherwise he will not get his money. So I found out that this guy was a crook. So I called President Carter back. I said, Mr. President, this guy is no good. His money is black money. So he did not get the money from him. So that's honest Jimmy Carter is. So let's give him a round of applause.
Are you going to make up for that, RK?
Yes.
And RK, I know you got a good question, so tell your good question.
Okay, the good question is, this is to Jason and Paige. The question is that this is such a big audience, why don't you invite them legally and professionally for them to attend the Carter Center board meetings?
That's a great idea. We will send an invitation to our next Board of Counselors meeting. We would love to have people come to the Board of Counselors meeting. We'll just need you to RSVP so we can have this. It's not Brussels sprouts because it's in the morning, but we'd love to do that. Thank you, RK. Great idea.
I think District Governor Andre has a question, please.
First of all, thank you so much. One of the things you mentioned is the religious community and collaborative partnership. Have you thought about grassroots organizations that can help with that process? Living in Southwest Georgia, which is the Bible Belt, I find that we don't do enough reaching out to the grassroots organizations that can help with that relationship. And most of the meetings one sees, I do see, are in churches rather than in communities, whether or not we can move that process. My question to you, are we getting the people that will listen and really being able to engage the difficult conversations? Have we touched that community of people?
Yeah, we reach out in an effort to touch it. We work with a group called Freedom Road, and we can talk more about it. I'm happy to follow up with you on that. You're right, because everything's at the local level, and if you're not touching that, then you're actually not going to initiate any change or even any conversation. So that's an area that we're expanding on. I'd love to talk to you about it.
And I'll just note that from a grassroots standpoint, the guinea worm eradication program, for example, requires, yes, there's 3,000 employees, but there's probably how many volunteers that get leveraged? 100,000, 150,000. And so the only way we've ever done any work is at the village level.
Right.
And I mean that like a Southwest Georgia village, like Plains, right? I mean, like this is who the Carter Center feels most comfortable with, is the people at the end of the road in those communities. And those are not just people that receive stuff from us. They are our partners that we put faith in to make changes in the world. And that doesn't just apply on a health program. It's not just we're going to do this as part of a global public health campaign. That's also the basis for the belief in human rights, the basis for the belief in democracy, right? People, regular people, making choices, are ready to make the right choice, are ready to change the world, ready to change their own lives. That's the basis of the belief in human rights and the basis of democracy, et cetera. And being able to take people and be with them where they are in their religious communities and elsewhere is exactly how the Carter Center has built that support around the world. And we're beginning that process a little bit more at home.
Thank you.
Thank you, District Governor. Baha?
Thank you for being here. You mentioned October 7th has been a big setback. It's unfortunate to see the loss of the Israeli civilians during that day. And now we're at 25,000 Palestinians, and Gaza is, I want to say, about 80% destroyed. What is the Carter Center specifically doing to going back and bridging those dialogues between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Arabs and the Jewish population?
Again, one of the great aspects of Paige's career is having spent years in the Middle East and North Africa at USAID on the ground in communities. And so I'm going to let her answer this question just to say, for us, and for me personally, as Paige mentioned, this is a moment where we miss my grandfather's voice, I think, because he did so much to drive a discussion of the humanity and the humanitarian situation of Palestinians. And the tragedy of the last several months has been incredibly difficult for all of us to watch. And the question becomes, you look at other parts of the world that have come back from something like this, and the results are very difficult, and it's going to take a very, very long time. And it didn't begin, well, I'll let Paige get into the specifics of what we're doing, but just to say, that we feel an obligation in a fundamental way to keep our eyes on how we get to that future. Go ahead.
Yeah, you could keep talking if you want, though. No, and this is a really difficult one. Fortunately, President Carter had a lot of contacts. He always wanted us to speak to everybody, and he still has those contacts. So we've been in Doha, we've been in Qatar, we've been part of the conversations with groups that others aren't able to talk to. We have those contacts, and so we've continued along that, relaying messages. We're playing that sort of behind-the-scenes role, at the same time trying to focus on what we have been for the past 4 or 5 years, which are Palestinian elections, rule of law issues in Israel. It's complicated. It's much more complicated now, but those conversations are something that your grandfather set us up for, and we are continuing to pull the thread on all of those discussions. And
Okay, we're in the lightning round now, so Jeff?
Yeah. 30 years ago, I was on that committee. What'll happen after the president reduces his commitment greatly? And he wrote a poem. You're allowed to say I'm going to die. But we had talked about maybe having another Nobel Peace Prize winner, because you two have a lot of credibility, but out in the full world, having a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a Jane Goodall, maybe carries us on for 10 years. Where do we stand with that?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of discussions about when and why we need someone with external credibility, right? And so one of the times we use people with external credibility is in a lot of these election observations where we're walking in, talking to heads of state in Tanzania or Kenya or somewhere else, and we'll invite other heads of state. And sometimes, often it's former Prime Minister of Senegal, for example, who would have a very, very strong presence in West Africa. And there's others, Colin Powell has participated or did participate in a lot of things with us, and John Kerry, there have been others. And so we are able to deploy that in different ways, but we've really transformed the center to such a degree that the on-the-ground track record is what drives what we're doing. Now, in a moment like this, where you have the need for significant diplomatic intervention in somewhere like Israel, Gaza, we miss the ability to convene those meetings, and we do our best on that sort of track 2 diplomacy standpoint to continue to drive discussion among folks, and then recruit or do our best to inform the people that have the ability to do that sort of top track diplomacy. But we have found in Syria and elsewhere that we can be really effective in that track 2 level because of that credibility and because of the folks that are making real decisions, that we don't miss it very much. And we certainly don't need it for the health programs, et cetera. I'll just say the last on that, the real leadership that's come on health these days, the biggest name in all of that is essentially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? And that partnership is really deep. It's based a lot on really looking at track records, looking at demonstrable results, and we've always been really, really good at building that track record and having that discussion.
Jason and Paige, thank you so much for your leadership at the Carter Center. Let's give them a hand.
Oh, that's great.
I also want to give another hand to District Governor Andre. Let's give District Governor Andre a hand.